Welcome to issue or number 2 of reading Redhawks. So I was going to try and get my LeVar Burton glasses made in time, but I couldn't do that. So what we're going to talk about today are some supply chain issues that some of us are experiencing as consumers, and also the organizations that we work for are having some supply, or we're having some supply challenges and then likely will in the future as all of us try and pivot into what looks like to be a new normal for a few years anyway. So I have some slides to talk about the basics of supply chain, what we've seen happening, why some of these shortages have occurred, and then a couple of questions for you to consider. We'll send you out in the breakout room so you can get to meet each other real quick and share what experiences have been being at the end of a supply chain as a consumer, and maybe some of the things that your organizations are doing to address some of the challenges either through supply or demand, or our ability to actually do conversion. So I'm going to start my slides so you can follow along. So the title was "Where's the Yeast?" because yeast was really in shortage there for a while, and still is a bit. I looked at a store the other day and they actually had yeast for the first time in a couple of months. So we should, based on some research I was doing earlier this week, that we should see yeast coming back pretty fully by the end of June for sure. So here's our agenda, what they are, and the commercial versus consumer sides of those. Supply chains are actually our systems. So we'll talk a little bit about systems thinking, some of the changes of the initiatives that companies are working on, or in systems world, we call those interventions. What folks are doing, we look at some of the COVID related changes, how companies have responded, their own interventions, and then what we think about is going to happen in the future. So what is a system first, and the bigger picture? A system, you can see the definition there, it's stuff connected to achieve a purpose. So in the supply chain, our stuff is going to be, there's a physical object there, like a warehouse and a truck and a train and an airplane and a store and a consumer that are in there. But the intangible things, we're going to have processes and policies, and we have software making decisions, we have spreadsheets and people, relationships between buyers and suppliers are all part of this supply chain system. But we also have a solar system and a transportation system and a education system, et cetera. All these are systems that work together and sometimes get out of alignment, if you will, out of equilibrium, and then they try and find their way back into equilibrium overall. So at the base of the supply chain, in the base of operations processes or base of operations are processes. You can see a definition here. It's a series of actions, steps we might do in a particular sequence to get some stuff done. Sort of like a system, maybe a miniature system, if you will, but inputs, transformation into outputs like yeast, right? And things that we might purchase. So you can think about what the inputs for yeast might be. If you had a chance to look at that article, they had yeast culture and some oxygen, and then some of the other inputs they would have would be packaging material. So the little jars that they use, or the paper packets, the sachets, and then in their transformation process will be their big vats to do their fermentation for yeast, and also the workers. How are they? And then outputs will be jars of yeast, big giant containers of yeast that they might sell to commercial. There's waste water that would come out of that yeast making process. And the people who are managing that, measuring it, are interested in, well, how well is it performing? So one of the big definitions of the process or big metrics is productivity. You have productivity in your car. This is how I remember it, because sometimes we have too many things to remember. Your car productivity is miles per gallon. So that's outputs divided by inputs. So our definition of productivity here is whatever's happening at the end of our what we're trying to produce, jars of yeast, pounds of yeast, whatever it is, divided by how many inputs we had to get there. So the productivity of that is going to be important. The financial people are interested in the return on investment of this capital and labor. So how much return are they getting for the outputs they're creating relative to the investment and inputs that are required to get there. Related to that will be capacity. For yeast making, how much vats and fermentation tanks do they have to convert inputs into outputs? Because they have too much capacity, that's going to negatively affect their ROI. if they're holding on to extra. So that's part of what we're seeing over time. Supply chains have become very much in balance. And that was kind of that intro picture I had, as we're trying to balance supply and demand. And when one of those changes dramatically, we're out of balance, we're out of alignment, and then we're going to see some shortage. So here's a shot of a supply chain now, not the process of an individual company. Imagine each of these organizations in this supply chain, they're loaded with processes. But ultimately converting demand signals from consumers through retailers and then the rest of the players in the supply chain all the way through back to producing yeast back here in manufacturing. So when we see this, they're stocked out at Safeway or stocked out at Fred Meyer or wherever it might be. Where's the yeast? Well, they're still working on making some, but everyone bought all the yeast that was downstream of manufacturing. That all got sucked up immediately, and it takes a while. There's a delay in the system to go from yeast production to in the bread that we're making in our houses. Hopefully you're all working on your bread baking skills these days, if you have yeast, that is. Another way to think about supply chains is that they are moving stuff. They're buying materials, converting those materials, that's the transformation, and delivering those outputs. But ultimately there's a plan. And this plan is related to the ideals of the objectives of the supply chain, also the objectives of the CFO. I like to, in classes, some of you have heard me say this before, thanks, or hi all the folks that I've had in class, that you could have too much inventory that nobody wants, too little of the inventory that people really do want, and I like to call it Goldilocks. So enough to make the sale, but not too much that the CFO is going crazy. So just the right amount of inventory, and that comes from a plan. And the reason we have to plan is because of time. So if you've ever seen the Jetsons cartoon, and they just, the little boy's hungry, so he pushes the wall, and boom, there's a sandwich right away. We don't have, there's time in our system, there's delays in the system. So we have to plan ahead how we're going to use the capacity to make stuff for what we think people are going to buy in the future, right? So we're planning, we're forecasting of what might occur. And many of you have heard me say this before too, the future is very hard to predict, as it turns out. So planning means predicting the future. We're already not going to be successful if we're trying to predict what's going to happen. Here's some of the headlines of the articles that I sent out, or listed a few of those to have you look at. There's shortages going on all over in goods, and a lot of the consumer supply chains are catching up now. At the end of May, they've had 2 or 3 months to like, wow, that was amazing shock of demand. Where are the constraints in the supply chain? Where are the issues that we need to go address? The meat one is still going on. The constraint there is not in the farms, it's not in the grocery stores, it's in meat processing because of labor issues, because that labor is part of the process, the conversion process, transformation process. And if labor can't show up because of COVID, or if labor has to be separated for safety issues, or the other temperature checks and other productivity issues are going to show up to restrict how much output that system can create. So some of the demand issues are kind of remarkable. This was just for a week in early April, or the month of April and end of that would be March. 4x increase in yeast demand. And if you read that article, one of the issues that showed up for the yeast people is this is first quarter, it's springtime. This is not yeast season, this is their downtime. So in their planning, they're like, oh, demand always goes down in spring because people are not baking anymore, and it queues up, or it builds up into quarter 4 when the holidays are occurring here in the US and North America. So this 4x increase in demand, or as many as 6x, you can see some of these blue bars are after a pandemic. These were not planned for. So these unplanned increases in demand, they're going to show up as shortages because people are taking all of the planned for inventory based on what we thought was going to happen, based on previous demand patterns. Those are all gone away. Consumer behaviors. Consumers are hard to predict. I saw this little video of people queuing up in a Costco. This line is like 30 carts deep to get out of Costco. I'm not into waiting in lines that long. I probably wouldn't have stayed. But these people are happily getting in line and laughing at themselves a little bit, even because they're being filmed. This is something that was in USA Today, being filmed for that. So supply chains, we've been doing this for a long time. I've shown this to some of you have seen this slide before, similar. Who are these folks? They're part of the Terracotta Army. They were constructed 2,600 years ago, over a 10 or 12 year period. And how are they constructed? Distributed manufacturing. So a lot of what we're seeing in supply chain today is not really new for us. We've seen these. There was no. Let me say it again. No new theory has been created because of what we learned over the past 2 months in supply chain. All of what occurred could have been predicted by previous theory, and we've been doing this for a long time. That's why we know. So this was just distributed, parts produced different places, then brought together for final assembly. Fast forward a bit, and then we have the city-state of Venice. You know, what's that? 600 or 700 years ago, 670 years ago or so, at the peak of their power, and their power was through shipbuilding. They were great at that input, transformation, output model. Their ability to transform inputs into ships, both for military and trade purposes, allowed them to be quite a powerful issue. Here's our powerful region. Here's a painting by Canaletto, and then a picture of what that looks like still today standing. So more supply chain, more input, output, productivity, and source of power. And then fast forward a few hundred years, the beginning of the U.S. Springfield Armory. Here we're sourcing innovation. At the time, we couldn't make rifles in a repeated nature. So they invent process technology to make that happen. I was in Montana a couple of months ago and was at Travelers Rest State Park, and here is a replica of the model 1795, which was coming out of this early work out of Springfield Armory, where they brought the suppliers together because no one knew how to do it. They had to invent, and I use that today as an example of sourcing innovation and know-how rather than just buying stuff. Probably one of the most quintessential examples is the Rouge plant in Detroit, where Ford was converting iron ore into steel, stamping out that steel and converting it into Model Ts. And some of you might know, in 1923, the Ford Motor Company was able to go from ore to car in about 78 hours. So that's 4 or 5 days 100 years ago, which is still mind-boggling every time I think about it. Now, what color was that, or what, how much flexibility did they have in that Model T? This is any color you want as long as it's black, right? They had one SKU they made over and over and over again, and that's how they got that. The productivity to go way high. There was a trade-off, less choice for customers at a time. So how does this stuff happen? It's all over the world. Some of you are here representing logistics organizations and the supply chain profession. We're moving stuff. I'm here zooming to you from North Beacon Hill. I can look over and see what I'm looking out my window looks just like this picture right over the shipping terminal here in Seattle. Stuff's moving around. And you might not know that the shipping container was invented by a satellite. That standardization really kind of changed how things move and built to production. So the strategy part of supply chain is this alignment. I use this slide in class a lot. I tried to find some more clever pictures of alignment. I couldn't really. So the top is the strategy of the company. How are they competing? How are they being different? And then related to that in the upper right here is how do they make money, or what's their goals? And the theory says the more the decisions we make in supply chain and operations to support the customer value proposition, the better the company should perform. Financially, customer service wise, everything should be going up. So that alignment is that balance slide I had earlier. We're trying to balance the decisions and capabilities to what the market wants, either through how we're being different or also through volume. We're seeing volume flexibility changes all over the place. This week, Boeing announced a bunch more layoffs because they're changing their level of capacity to meet what they think demand's going to be, right? To bring capacity into alignment to demand so that they can meet financial obligations. So but what happens if you have a lot of different customers and a lot of different markets that you serve? And here's an example that I also used in class from a Sloan article, Sloan Management Review. Dell did a few years ago is they realized they had more than one supply chain. So to be into alignment, what did they do? They created 4 different supply chains to be in alignment to their 4 main market segments. And again, showing the theory, the more in alignment you are to the demands of your segment, the better you should perform. And think about this built to spec for corporate clients. Those of you that work for the Boeing company have Dell computers and you're in this box, right? All of you are getting the same computer. Boeing's buying them at thousands at a time. So Dell's cranking them out very high volume. But if you were to go buy a Dell computer after this session, you would buy a one-off, very low volume build to order model. So to manage those and be into alignment, there's 2 different businesses really. So they've created separate supply chains to be into better alignment. And that's been important for our COVID experience, because food supply chain has also been split into 2. They might not have 4 like Dell does, but a company like King Arthur has their consumer supply chain that they're trying to sell into. They also have their commercial supply chain that they're selling into. So not very many of us used to buy 50-pound bags of flour. Now some of us has, because those are the only bags we could get. There's one of the articles I sent out to you or linked to was about a company in Seattle taking these 50 and 100-pound bags and then repackaging them into 5-pound bags because the grocery stores were out. And that's kind of that pivot from, well, my supply chain was aligned for commercial, and somebody's like intervening in that supply chain saying, yeah, I'm going to break this 50-pound bag, 100-pound bag down into these 5-pound bags to do so. One of the, I think it might be the next slide I have, there's a great article in the last couple of weeks that came out about King Arthur flour in particular and how they've adjusted and it started with demand sensing because of their call centers and their helplines about baking. Like, wow, people are asking if we have flour and trying to order flour from us. Like, are you sure this is demand's going up. So they were able to get a little bit ahead in terms of finding, and here's the article I was talking to, in terms of responding to that uptick in demand. They actually, if you've ever read the book, The Goal, and some of you have because I asked you to read it, and some of you have because it's good for you. In The Goal, they have capacity issues in their factory at one point. And the answer is go find any capacity you can, because that's the constraint in the ability of the system to move more product. So as demand went up, they found the constraint, and one of the ways they could get more capacity was through a supplier, but that supplier could only sell in 3-pound bags. So if you're bought King Arthur, their bags are paper and 5-pound. This company had plastic and 3-pound. They're like, yeah, we're not so into the plastic, but you can process more flour, and we can increase our capacity to be in more balance to what demand's going to be. So I don't know how long their contract was, 4 or 6 months with that supplier to make that happen. So they designed new packaging, new picture that company could put on their 3-pound bag of flour, and then build that out. So and that's part of a system intervention. As we go back to that definition of a system, what to do, how to respond. All of our organizations are trying to figure out how to respond to COVID. What's going to happen to demand? We're certainly seeing that in higher ed. It would be a lot easier if we knew, well, what's going to be the status of a vaccine? What's going to be the status of people's risk willingness? How many students are coming back? Because then we could plan and make everything to be right-sized to what that's going to be. No one really knows. So we have to make multiple plans because, again, we can't exactly predict the future. So here's a couple of questions for you to consider in your breakouts. In the first one is kind of, well, what's happened to you? What was your experience around shortages, or did you go out and hoard some toilet paper or hoard some other kind of products? What's happening? Have you changed your diet because you can't get meat? That would be a good idea if you could make that happen. And then the other 3 are kind of, what has your company's done? What have your organizations done in response to this? Their interventions, kind of like King Arthur went out and contracted with a supplier. King Arthur had a good story to tell or a good story to respond to. Demand was going crazy, yes. Versus some companies with demand going down, how are you going to downsize your capacity to bring that supply and demand into balance? So I think you can talk about some of the things your companies have done real time. And then what about the future? Who benefits from COVID-19? Testing companies, maybe big pharma is going to benefit. I would have thought that healthcare was going to benefit, but no, we're seeing lots of furloughing and layoffs happening across that industry. And then how do you think supply chains might better manage? So maybe when you go into your breakouts, I'm not sure you have enough time to get through all 4 of these. You can pick a couple that the other folks you're in the room with want to discuss. Well, thanks for spending some of your Thursday afternoon here, and thanks for the advancement team for putting this together. I think it's a great idea.